Great. So first things first, we are going to be recording the webinar this afternoon. This recording will be posted on our website later this week. So for folks who were not able to attend today or signed up and wanted to go back and revisit this call, you will have access to that again in the next couple of days. You will also see on the bottom of your screen a couple of features on Zoom. The first one says raise hand. We will not be using this feature today just in an effort to manage questions and comments, but we will be using two other features. One of them is labeled as Q&A, and we do ask that if you have a question for either Heather or I or our panelists who will be presenting later in the call, that you use the Q&A feature to submit your question. You can submit those anonymously if you'd like to. And in addition to that, you can also upvote questions of interest. So if someone submits a question before you that you would also like to hear answered, please feel free to use that feature to show us which questions you would like to hear about. And then lastly, you should be able to utilize the chat option as well. We'd love for you to put your name and organization in the chat just to introduce yourself to other attendees. We have a lot of folks signed up today, and we really appreciate folks' interest in hearing more about this session. So again, throughout the call, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, but keep specific questions about the presentation to the Q&A chat, Q&A option, because that's where we will be checking. So thanks so much for your help in that respect. Before we get going again, want to give a little overview of our agenda today. So we're going to start with Heather providing some more background about the Washington Student Achievement Council in terms of how we operate as an agency and center around our strategic action plan, which has some specific policy focuses and clusters that really center the work we do to improve access to post-secondary education and post-secondary attainment. We'll then go into the 2024 legislative session, both with respect to WASAC's requests and the requests of our external stakeholders, and then talk a little bit more about the budget outcomes of the session before taking questions, again, through the Q&A feature that you can submit through the presentation. We'll then pause for a minute to answer some of those questions and then continue on with a panel discussion. I'm really excited to say that we have three key stakeholders to WASAC with us today, specifically Nancy Canales-Montiel from the Washington Student Association, Neil Strege from the Washington Roundtable, and Bill Line from United Faculty of Washington. So again, thank you to those folks for joining us, and we'll be sure to talk with them soon. We'll be finishing off with a closing activity to take a little bit of a snapshot of the issues that attendees are thinking of today as we go through the call, and we welcome your participation as we get to the end there. So with that, I will move ahead slides and turn it over to Heather to talk more about WASAC.
Thank you, Joel. So I'll give just a quick overview for those of you that are less familiar with the Washington Student Achievement Council. We have a 10-member governor-appointed council with representatives from the 4-year public baccalaureates, 2-year community and technical colleges, and our 4-year not-for-profits, as well as K-12. You'll see we also have student representatives as well. Under the council and the governor's leadership, WASAC is uniquely charged with increasing post-secondary attainment and closing equity gaps. And to that end, we are charged with proposing the goals, recommending resources, and monitoring progress towards those goals. Next slide. Washington has a post-secondary attainment goal, like many of you probably know, that at least 70% of Washington adults will have some form of post-secondary credential beyond high school. Many of you also likely know we are falling short. So among adults in Washington, ages 25 to 44, we're at around 62% of adults with that post-secondary credential. This really drives all of our work. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that in addition to looking at the overarching goal, we also are focused on closing equity gaps and leading with racial equity, particularly looking at the disparity between Native Americans, Black, Latino, and other communities of color with attainment levels as low as 26%. As we move into our work, we approach this through a framework that essentially has 4 key strategies with equity embedded throughout. And our theory is that if we build an affordable and a supportive educational environment, more Washington residents will enroll in and complete a credential-bearing program. So this slide shows our strategic framework adopted by the council. And this is the framework that we use throughout our time today as we talk about policy proposals to increase post-secondary attainment. And we've also included a link for those of you that haven't seen a link to our 2024 strategic action plan. We're in the midst of finalizing that for this upcoming year. It's important to note too, as we talk through the proposals today and as we read the strategic action plan, it's not agency specific. Our goal is really statewide and thinking about what are, certainly programs that WASAC manages and initiatives that WASAC manages, but more importantly, are as a state, what are the broader investments, the statewide programs, the state initiatives, and that broader state policy environment that really helps support students on their post-secondary attainment. Next slide. So before I hand it back to Joel to go through the past legislative session, I wanted to give a quick overview of what does the cycle of policy development and stakeholder engagement look like. You'll see on this slide, breaking it out by 2024 and 2025, we're wrapping up the last legislative session. And in preparation for already the next legislative session and thinking about what are those policy issues that were successful this year and what were some areas that didn't quite pass that we know are still on folks' radars. So that will be the bulk of our time today. This slide shows you that we as a council and as a part of the governor's executive cabinet have two main roles in which we will seek our council's endorsement on policy and budget requests in August. When we submit what are called decision packages that may include both budgetary ask as well as a legislative ask to the governor in September. And then the governor releases the budget in December, and then the next session starts in January. Historically, WASAC has held at least one stakeholder engagement session during the summer. We hope to do additional stakeholder engagement sessions. And if you're not familiar with folks on our strategy and partnerships team, there are individuals designated for each of our cluster areas that are engaging with folks throughout the year on developing policy proposals and informing potential budget asks. So this just helps to give a snapshot of the way that we approach our work and thinking about how essential it is for all of you here today joining us. Whether you're in K-12, higher education, a community-based organization, a legislator, private philanthropic member, we really seek out a diverse group of stakeholders to inform what is going to help students in their post-secondary attainment and what is the environment that we need to ensure that success. So really glad you all are here today. And with that, I will hand it back to Joel to go through the past legislative session.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Heather. So as she just mentioned, we are going to start our overview of the 2024 legislative session by looking at outcomes for our agency specifically before transferring to the broader post-secondary education landscape. And we'll first look at the budget before looking at specific pieces of legislation. So the table that you see on your screen in front of you represents the majority of the budget requests that WASAC submitted to the governor's office prior to the 2024 legislative session. This is not a comprehensive list, and I do want to note a couple things before diving into specific items here. It's really important to note that both the Washington College Grant and the College Bound Scholarship, two of our signature state financial aid programs, are caseload forecasted programs. And this means that funding for those financial aid awards is entitled. And so if there are more students who sign up and are eligible for the college grant in a given year, the state has to fund those things. So for some of the bills on this slide, you'll see that are related to a program like the Washington College Grant, there is additional capacity to provide more funding for those in the future. And again, funding can be increased to meet program demand moving forward. The requests in this table were also all considered by the legislature to be policy level. And so that means that funding can be used to help WASAC administer and expand our work in areas like student financial assistance. To use a couple of these items as examples, we'll be talking about legislation on our next slide, but the first item here, House Bill 2214, it has to do with using SNAP participation to identify eligibility for the Washington College Grant. And you'll see here that we received $239,000 in the governor's budget, as well as the legislature's final budget. And that funding is provided for us to cover administrative costs and collaborate with agencies like DSHS to determine how can we correctly notify students who are eligible for the college grant under this new pathway, and make sure we're doing that in a way that is appropriate for both of our agencies. Building on that, the second bill, which we'll talk about again on the next slide, Senate Bill 5904, we also received funding for that legislation to again cover administrative costs, as well as things like immediate costs that may come to us for students who now have increased eligibility for a student financial aid program. There are a couple other things we wanted to note about this summary as well. One of which is that even though WASAC has to submit all of our budget and policy requests to the governor's office prior to the legislative session, we can still receive funding as an agency for requests that are not initially funded in the governor's budget. So you'll see a couple examples of this here. In House Bill 2025, for example, which has to do with the state work study program, this was a bill submitted by WASAC that did not make it initially into the governor's budget, but was picked up by a different legislator under their own accord, and ended up passing the legislature. And so while we did not get funding for that back in December, the legislature did provide about $200,000 for us to implement that legislation in their final budget. Another great example of this dynamic has to do with OtterBot. Some folks on this call may be familiar, but it is an AI-based texting tool that can provide guidance to students looking to fill out post-secondary or financial aid applications. And we requested some support for that program to expand the scope and the use of that tool. While that was not included in the governor's budget, we were able to effectively partner with groups like the Washington Student Association, who potentially could speak about this later today, but to talk more with legislators on WSA's behalf. They were able to talk about this proposal, and as an agency, we were able to provide technical assistance about, what is the OtterBot program, what student populations does this program serve, and what are some of our recommendations for improving this work in the future. So again, this provides a really another effective example of partnership with external groups. And then lastly, we wanted to note that some issues that WASAC requests are ultimately not funded to the level that we hope to see in the final budget. So we received less funding than we had requested for a couple of items, including award levels for the National Guard Grant Program and for the Passport to Careers Program. This, of course, can impact how we administer programs in the future, but is a reminder that we submit a request, again, is vetted by both the governor's office and the legislature, and then we administer programs as they are funded to us after the legislative session. We also did not receive funding for telehealth access, which is something that was brought up a couple of times in our stakeholder engagement sessions last summer. And so that was not funded in the governor's budget or in the final legislative budget, but continues to be something that we think about in support of student well-being. Moving on from our budget requests, we wanted to dive in a little bit to the specific legislation that WASAC requested this session and how those bills fared. So just to remind folks again, we submitted 4 bills to the governor's office for consideration before the 2024 session. And the first 3 bills on your slide, House Bill 2214, Senate Bill 5904, and Senate Bill 6053, were all approved or funded in the governor's budget, and all also passed the legislature, which is something we're really excited about. It's actually the first time that WASAC has had more than one bill pass the legislature in partnership with our legislative sponsors. So we're really excited about this development this year. We also wanted to touch on House Bill 2025, which initially started as a WASAC proposal, and then after not being in the governor's budget, was taken up specifically by Representative Reed, and then she championed that bill through the legislature, and then it was returned to WASAC to administer. So we'll touch on that as well. Starting with our first bill here, again, 2214 from Representative Vandana Slatter. We are really thrilled about this legislation, and we see it as kind of a groundbreaking initiative that can expand access to state financial aid in the future. Specifically, this bill will start taking effect in the 2025-26 school year, so not this upcoming fall, but the following year. and it'll enable our state to automatically qualify high school students in grades 10 through 12 who receive SNAP benefits for the Washington College Grant Award. This auto qualification is also able to be done regardless of whether a student has submitted a FAFSA or a WASFA. And I do want to clarify that SNAP, otherwise, you may have heard this program called food stamps in previous years. Students can also qualify for this pathway through the Food Assistance Program, which serves non citizens in Washington state who do have a documented immigration status. Conversely, the SNAP program only serves US citizens, but we're excited that both of those programs are included in this pathway. Again, we are really excited about this news. We think it allows us to continue thinking about how can we streamline access to state financial aid through public assistance, and um, better improve access again to this program. Um, this bill will enable us to guarantee at least 1 year of the Washington College Grant to a student getting SNAP or food assistance program benefits. And at most, a student who is on SNAP throughout high school, again, through their family, for example, as a dependent, will be able to graduate high school with 3 years of the college grant guaranteed to them before filing a FAFSA or WASFA. And this is a really important development for us. How the process works in a typical year, given the FAFSA, is that a student files it in the fall of their senior year, and then sometime in the spring, they find out where they were admitted to a post secondary program and what their financial aid packages look like. Because of this legislation, we will now be able to start notifying students of their eligibility for the Washington College Grant as early as spring of their 10th grade year. So that gives us almost 2 additional years of lead time to communicate to students, you will get the Washington College Grant as long as you enroll in a post-secondary program. And there's probably additional aid out there, whether that's the federal Pell Grant or other forms of state financial aid that are accessible to you. So, for so many different reasons, this is a really huge deal for our agency. And I do want to note that on top of this bill, we continue to strongly encourage all students to file a FAFSA or a WASFA financial aid application to ensure that all possible financial aid is made available to them. Moving on to the second bill of interest, Senate Bill 5904 is one that we have been pursuing for a couple of years now, and specifically is going to allow students who get the Washington College Grant to have an additional year of eligibility so that the Washington College Grant is aligned with the federal Pell Grant at 6 years of funding or 150% the length of a post secondary program. Again, this is something that's been pursued for some time now, so we're really excited to see this change from the legislature. And the bill also includes a couple other programmatic changes for the College Bound Scholarship and the Passport to Careers programs. Both of those programs are also aligned with the Pell Grant, which is, again, a fantastic thing for students and families, but also campus financial aid administrators who previously have had to track all of these programs on different timeframes. We're really excited to see that all of these programs, again, will kind of be on the same path now. And we think this is a really important equity issue for our state, given that some of our lowest income students, students supporting children, first generation students, and communities of color were oftentimes the ones who were exhausting their state financial aid eligibility before losing their federal Pell Grant. We also want to note that this bill removes the maximum age limit for the Passport to Careers program. So previously, a student would lose benefits if they turn 26. And now, as a result of this legislation, they will be able to use the full extent of their benefits, even if they turn 26 and then enter an additional academic year. So again, continue to be excited about this bill, not only for students and their families, but also for some of the administrative burdens that financial aid offices have previously faced. And then touching more briefly on the last two pieces of legislation here, Senate Bill 6053 is going to allow WASAC to enter data sharing agreements with OSPI to receive the contact information for high school students. This builds on legislation that was introduced during the 2023 session, which gave this permission to public four-year institutions. And receiving this information from OSPI directly will help us remove a number of administrative burdens that we currently face to administer programs like the College Bound Scholarship. It also is going to improve our ability to communicate with students across our state about things like FAFSA and WASFA completion, the Washington College Grant, and other state financial aid or post secondary educational opportunities available to them. And so some folks who work in the legislature may term this as a good little bill, but truly it is a great piece of legislation and something that is going to really help our college access work here at WASAC thrive. And then lastly, I wanted to talk briefly about House Bill 2025. Again, this was not included in the governor's budget, but it eliminates the salary matching requirements in the state work study program, separate from federal work study, for employers who are doing college access work as well as community service providers. So currently, we have a number of employers across the state who sign up with WASAC to host a student employee through the state work study program. And now there's essentially going to be some additional flexibility in how much of a student's salary those organizations have to match in order to host a student. I will note that WASAC determines the matching requirements on an annual basis according to how much funding we have available for the program. But we hope, ideally, that we will be able to employ more students through state work study, and particularly those, again, who are engaged in roles like peer mentorship to help students younger than them think more about their futures in post secondary programs and access both post secondary education and financial aid opportunities that are available to them. Now that we've talked a little bit, or so I should say, so now that we've talked a little bit more about what happened for WASAC this session, we wanted to talk as well about post-secondary education more broadly, and then pause to take some of your questions. So you'll see here, again, we'll start with the 2024 supplemental operating budget. And to better understand some of the investments that were made this session, we've broken them down by our strategic action plan and our policy clusters in areas of focus. Broadly, we saw investments across most of our policy clusters. So, enrollment, affordability, student supports, and then a couple other tangentially related proposals that we'll talk about briefly. And just want to note that since it was a supplemental budget year, these items were a little bit smaller compared to what you would see in like a initial biennial budget year, but are still going to be really impactful in the post-secondary education space. We also did not see any significant cuts to things that were proposed last year, and so we're excited to see that as well. But diving into specific items on the table before you, under the area of enrollment, there was continued interest this session in things like dual credit pathways, as well as college access programming. And we were excited to see funding for both of those things included in the budget. The first item you'll see here was almost $3.5 million for the college and the high school program. As a bit of review, last session, a bill was passed to remove fees for college and the high school and to allow more students to gain college credit in a high school setting. Although we saw very large increases in the take up of college and high school programming, which is great, there was a funding formula in that bill that actually reduced funding for college and the high school this year. And so the $3.43 million you see here was intended to kind of offset that cut that was made due to existing statute. And we are happy to say that this funding has fixed this problem for this year. And moving forward, we believe the funding formula will work as intended. But in this first year of rolling out the bill and accommodating large demand for college and the high school, the legislature had to make this fix to make sure that these programs had enough funding to function in the future. We also wanted to note that our K-12 system received $3 million for college access programming, which is going to be led in partnership with the College Success Foundation. This is building on a lot of the success of work through their Rally for College initiative and is going to help further invest in resources like college and career counseling and advising for students so that as they approach high school graduation, they're more aware of their post-secondary educational and financial aid opportunities available to them, and of course, able to access those things as they move into post-secondary programs. Moving on to affordability, as well as dual credit and college access, we also saw some interest this session in the idea of regional or locally based college promise programs to help students cover their costs related to post-secondary education. We'll touch briefly on that on our last slide before again getting into Q&A. But we did see an exciting investment for the Evergreen State College. They received a little over $200,000 for a program called Shelton Promise, which will allow students from the Shelton School District in the classes of 25 and 26 to attend Evergreen State College and have their costs partially funded through this pilot program. So while there were additional proposals through legislation that did not move forward this year, we did see this proviso move forward. And again, are excited to see how this plan plays out over the coming years. While we did not see any investments, broader investments in the completion cluster this session, we did want to highlight some really key numbers, both in student supports and in other areas of funding. So, again, similar to enrollment, this was a really big year for building on recent investments that the legislature has made in student basic needs security. And so, for reference, last year, there was legislation passed to provide a basic needs navigator on every public 2 and 4 year college campus to ensure that students had the help they needed in accessing programs like SNAP, housing support, and again, other forms of basic need support for things like childcare or transportation. I do want to give another shout out to groups like the Washington Student Association and the Post Secondary Basic Needs Coalition, who were able to secure more than $1 million to fully fund the implementation of that legislation and make sure that the correct staffing levels are available on each campus that is mentioned in that work. So that's really exciting. Also, some of that funding will go toward individual campus requests for things like support for food pantries or other basic needs systems that students are utilizing today on their campuses. We also saw a roughly $275,000 for a low income housing study, which we see as additional investment in better understanding the challenges that are facing our students with respect to basic needs. Outside of these three specific clusters, we also wanted to note a couple other investments that are, of course, related to the work that WASAC does and that all of our post-secondary institutions do. The first being that there was more than $1 million invested in the community and technical college system to help them produce more high-demand degrees, specifically bachelor's degrees in computer science. And this takes advantage of a pathway that was created in recent years, but previously not given a lot of funding to move forward. So this will allow them to kind of utilize that funding and produce those degrees for the first time. We also saw an initial investment of $1 million for career connected learning, to provide more post secondary students with meaningful real world job experiences at the same time that they're enrolled in school. So we were glad to see that funding and look forward to working with our partners in the workforce development space in the future. And with that, just before we again pause for some questions, we wanted to take a moment to talk about some of the specific legislation that passed this session, in addition to the budget items that we just talked about. So these were largely focused, again, under two of our policy clusters, specifically enrollment and affordability. And we've categorized them in a similar manner. Under enrollment, again, we've talked a little bit about the college and the high school programming and providing adequate funding for those programs. There was legislation passed this session to start piloting a free college and the high school program at one private not for profit institution to be determined. But again, building on the success of removing fees for college and the high school through public institutions, this legislation is attempting to expand the reach of that change to private not for profit institutions as well. Excuse me. We also saw significant movement under the affordability cluster this session. So, in addition to the work done through WASAC's legislation around the Washington College Grant, College Bound Scholarship, and Passport to Careers programs, we saw a number of other investments in legislative changes that we're really excited about. And these hinge on a couple of factors. Number one, we have seen, a lot of success related to the Washington College Grant, and we see that legislators and staff want to build on that success by providing more tailored support to specific student populations, as well as students who are entering specific industries and other areas of workforce development. And so there were four bills that kind of caught our eye this session that we wanted to highlight here. The first one is an extension of the National Guard Grant program. We're happy to say that this bill actually aligns the National Guard Grant with the federal Pell Grant in the same way that we were able to align the Washington College Grant and the College Bound Scholarship. So members of the National Guard will now have 6 years to use this funding toward a post-secondary degree or credential. And this bill also notes that National Guard members can transfer their benefits to their spouse or their dependent to pursue a degree or credential as well. We also saw the creation of a behavioral health scholarship pathway within a program we run called the Washington Health Corps. Again, to touch on kind of that catering towards specific workforce demand needs. And so we're excited to see that infrastructure being built out. And then in addition to that, we also saw the creation of a Native American apprenticeship program. This is separate from the Washington College grant from apprenticeships, but again, we feel that this is an important investment in a specific population, Native American students, and meeting workforce demands in the sectors most important to them. And so we're excited to see this program being developed and to see funding allocated for it in the final legislative budget. And then lastly, we wanted to note that there was some significant legislation passed this session to provide access to federal and state financial aid for incarcerated students who are taking courses, again, while incarcerated, toward a post-secondary degree or credential. We're looking forward to continuing to provide technical assistance in how this bill is administered between post-secondary and correctional partners, but we're happy to see this moving forward. While we did not see any major legislation passed in relation to our other clusters, completion and student supports, again, there was a lot of continued interest in concepts like college promise funding. So, how do we cover gaps and help more students fully fund their post secondary education? But also initiatives like guaranteed admissions, a program that's currently run, and then financial aid navigation. How do we better connect students to resources available to them throughout financial aid offices, through school districts, through ESDs, through other partners in the K-12 and post-secondary education spaces to ensure that they know of and can apply to the opportunities available to them. With that, I do want to pause for a couple of minutes. I see that we have a number of questions in the Q&A feature, and that Heather has been monitoring them. And so with that, we would love to answer a couple of those before we move to our panel discussion. But Heather, do you have any questions that you want to highlight?
We've gotten a few questions on the SNAP proposal. Breaking it down, there's kind of three parts to the questions. One is around how do students actually apply if they don't have to submit a FAFSA? So let's answer that. There's a question around terms of eligibility. Why is it only 3 years, and explaining that 3-year eligibility, as well as questions around how will we contact the students and how does that relate to the other data bill? So do you want to try and tackle all three of those, Phil?
Yeah, absolutely. I will do my best, and then I will probably tap back to you to add any other details. So just giving a little bit more context for how this legislation works, specifically to the 3-year window, that is something that was actually in statute previously in relation to a couple other public assistance programs. And so we did not introduce that, but it does kind of align with financial aid applications, which we'll mention in just a second here. So essentially how it'll work is that a student who is on SNAP, again, through their family or the food assistance program, if their family is not US citizens, they will essentially trigger a pathway that will be developed in the future between us and DSHS to say this student is eligible for the Washington College grant. We know this because the minimum, I guess should say the maximum income threshold to receive the Washington College grant is higher than the maximum income threshold to receive SNAP or food assistance program benefits. So we don't need a student to essentially kind of redocument over and over and over that they meet certain income thresholds when they're already verifying their income through SNAP. From a technical standpoint, WASAC does have the authority in statute to deem applications as sufficient demonstrations of financial aid eligibility. And so for this bill, we will be able to say that SNAP or food assistance program enrollment is sufficient proof to qualify students for the Washington College grant. Again, I want to make sure I don't get too confusing here, but in terms of the 3-year limit for how this bill would apply, essentially this has to do with when you file a FAFSA to attend a post-secondary program and what income that application uses. So in a given year, let's maybe not use fall 23 given the FAFSA simplification process ongoing. But if you were to file a FAFSA in the fall, you were actually using your income from the previous calendar year. So if I filed in fall 2023, I'm using my 2022 tax income. And how that lines up with the academic year is that students applying for their first year of a post-secondary program are using income that was earned by their families during the spring of their sophomore year or their 10th grade year and the fall of their junior year or their 11th grade year. So if we kind of bucket those together, if we have the spring of 10th grade and fall of 11th grade as one year, the spring of 11th grade and the fall of 12th grade as a second year, and then the spring of 12th grade before a student graduates um, as kind of that third year, we can then basically extend out into the future and say, if this student filed a FAFSA in these 3 years, their income has already been verified to receive SNAP benefits, and therefore they also qualify for the Washington College Grant. So we will be able to make that determination again in partnership with DSHS. And while the specifics, I see another question here that was mentioned about data sharing. The specifics of those pathways are still to be determined. But what I will say for now is that there are a couple of public assistance programs in statute already to qualify students for the Washington College Grant. And we've been able to successfully collaborate with DSHS on notifying those students. I believe DSHS actually sends out a notification that we have helped, work with them on to make sure students know that they're eligible for this aid. And so I imagine a similar process will take place. But regardless, we will be collaborating with DSHS to make sure that students are appropriately notified of their eligibility and know about that moving forward as well.
Let me just add one more thing onto that, which for folks that are less familiar with this, there was actually a bill a few years ago that passed that enabled public benefit programs to already have that alignment with the Washington College Grid. So this is building off of that already existing statute. One of the things that we learned through that was this isn't going to be like hundreds of thousands of new people all of a sudden taking advantage of this. This is a procedural change that will require WASAC to work very closely with DSHS, with the colleges, with potentially our K-12 partners to figure out what will work in the data collection, data sharing. And we've been in those conversations already. And now that the law is passed, we'll kind of ramp up and dig into the implementation. But so just to clarify on this is adding on a new program of that auto eligibility that will allow us to get to folks much earlier, and essentially people that are already eligible for Washington College Grant. That way they will know that they are indeed going to have that tuition and fees covered.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. And I can touch on a couple of the other questions in the chat. Just briefly about what does the college grant currently receive. In the 2023-24 academic year, there's roughly $430 million in Washington College Grant awards going out to students across our state. And so again, for context, we're hoping, of course, that more students will utilize the college grant in the future. And that program is entitled funding and will continue to receive funding as the student caseload shifts over time. In terms of the Passport to Careers program, so that program does have age limits on it. The maximum age limit is 26, which has now been removed, which is great. But there is still a minimum age requirement. So a student has to basically enroll in a post-secondary program by the time they turn 22 in order to receive and utilize passport benefits. That age limit is still in place for now, but our bill did remove the upper age limit. So for the small subset of students who, if they start a post-secondary degree at 21, for example, and let's say they end up taking the full 6 years of the Washington College Grant, the last year where they are 26 or 27 and may no longer be eligible for passport, they will now be able to continue using that even if they were previously above that older age cutoff. So wanted to touch on that passport question. A couple other brief budget clarifications. The funding allocated to the College Success Foundation for college access programming, it was an increase from the biennial budget released last session. I will say they initially requested in partnership with OSPI, I believe it was $8.86 million, and then the governor's budget included $3 million, and then the final legislative budget included $3 million. So it is an increase, and they will continue to use that funding moving forward. The other thing is I wanted to briefly touch on the funding for basic needs support, the 1.17 million. So that is being split across the public institution, the public 4 years, and the community and technical college system to fund their basic needs navigator positions. Essentially, the legislation required a certain level of staffing, like a proportion of FTEs, but then the final budget last session did not fully fund that requirement. And so this additional funding in the supplemental year allows colleges to fully fund their required staffing position under that legislation. Heather, are there any other questions you'd like to touch on before we go to the panel?
There was just a request for additional information on details on some of these budgeted items, and we will be publishing something up on our website. We'll share out with this group for folks that are interested, a summary. We can share these slides afterwards as well. So more information to come. And for those of you that we didn't get to your questions, we're happy to follow up afterwards.
Perfect. Well, I know that we're about halfway done with our time. And so again, we do have a recording of the webinar. We'll be happy to follow up with other questions that we just haven't had a chance to touch on yet. But we do want to move forward and get to our panel discussion. And so before I stop sharing my screen for a bit here, I just want to give a huge thank you to our 3 panelists today. Again, we have Nancy Canales-Montiel, Executive Director of the Washington Student Association, Neil Strege, Vice President of the Washington Roundtable, and Bill Line, President of United Faculty of Washington. They're here with us to share their perspectives on the 2024 legislative session, again, from kind of their sectors and organizations. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and invite Nancy, Neil, and Bill to start their cameras, and then we'll get started here in just a second. All right. Well, again, thanks everyone for joining us. It's great to have you all here. And just to kick us off, we will go to Nancy first, Neil, and then Bill. But could you each just share a little bit more about your individual sectors and kind of what are some of your ongoing priorities with respect to post-secondary education?
Yeah, thank you so much, Joel, for having us here today. My name is Nancy Canales Montiel, and I'm the Executive Director at the Washington Student Association. And for those unfamiliar with our group, we have been advocating for students since 1982, and we are the coalition of student governments from across the state. So we are 100% student-led and run. The WSA seeks to empower and amplify student voices in the legislative process in pursuit for a more affordable, inclusive, and accessible higher education system in Washington state. So some of the biggest priorities we had this session was obviously extending eligibility in any form or way to the Washington College Grant. We believe that this is the way that we're going to get the most accessible school system in the country. So our biggest priority this session was Senate Bill 5999, which is extending eligibility for Washington College Grant, particularly to those middle class families that are struggling with raising costs today. Overall, our students support any increases to financial aid this session. And we are currently looking at, as we draft our 2025 agenda, how to better help with any basic needs or any external barriers that diminish completion at the post-secondary education level. Our students, like I mentioned, are currently starting next session's agenda, and they're thinking a lot about how to help impacted families by rising costs. As we, like I mentioned, we don't want that to impact our completion rates at school. So we're having a lot of conversations about how to make sure that the Washington College Grant not only supports them financially, but how can we support with wraparound services. Some of the services that students are identifying as barriers to higher education is supports relating to childcare and access to healthy and affordable food on campus, as well as being able to have access to affordable and safe housing on campus as well. So, like I mentioned, our agenda is in process of drafting right now, so stay tuned for the discussions that students are having about what they need on the ground, but it is mostly related to the rising costs that we are seeing outside of post-secondary education.
Great, thanks, Nancy.
Yeah, hi everybody. Neil Strege with the Washington Roundtable. Washington Roundtable is a business association of senior executives from Washington's largest employers, and we ground obviously all of our work in the economics of higher education and employment in Washington State. We map back how many jobs are going to be available over the next, 5 to 10 years. And it's pretty consistent that 70% of Washington jobs require some form of post-secondary education. And so that's our goal, that the education system produce 70% of Washington students would achieve a credential by the end of their education career. That's across all racial and ethnic groups. So right now our state is producing about 40% of students coming out of the system by age 26 get a credential. And so there's a big gap between what the economy needs and what Washington students are achieving. And so, our goal is for more students to make it through that system with a credential. And our priority has really been around how do we do a better job of streamlining the system and making it easier for students to choose to go to post-secondary education. I like to say that our current thinking or our current message to students is, if you apply, you might get in, and if you fill out a FAFSA, you might get financial aid. And that really we need to be inviting students into the process. And the reality is, outside of UW, we have capacity at all of our institutions, and we need to be doing a better job of selling higher education to students. So to that end, this legislative session, our top priority bill was House Bill 2214, which Joel talked a lot about, the SNAP bill. And the idea behind that is that you're taking a group of students. There's 30,000 students who are currently on SNAP benefits who, they're sitting there wondering, is higher education for me? Do I have the grades to get in? Is it going to be affordable to me? And, you can tell these students who are on public assistance, their families are on public assistance, you qualify, you're in. And we really think that that's the type of policy that we need to be pursuing going forward. So that was really our highest priority. Our priority also was around guaranteed admissions. The vision, the greater vision is that if we could get all school districts signed up for the Council of Presidents Guaranteed Admissions Program, and get all students who qualify notification that, hey, you're guaranteed admission into all of our institutions in the state, and you can marry that with guaranteed financial aid, then you're telling students who are wondering, is college for me, and am I going to be able to afford it, that you're in, and you have these resources available to you. So that's sort of our dream. The SNAP bill was great. We really were pleased that we were able to get that over the finish line. And the guaranteed admissions bill, which was House Bill 2077, we weren't able to quite get that over the finish line, but we really believe that that's important policy that we'll work on going forward. So I'll stop there, Joel, and let Bill go next.
Great. Thanks, Neil.
Hi, everybody. My name is Bill Line. I'm a professor up here at Western Washington University and the president of the United Faculty of Washington State. We represent the faculty at Eastern, Western, Central, and Evergreen. I'm also one of the co-directors of the College Promise Coalition, which is a coalition I think that a lot of people on this webinar are part of. It's generously funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and our overall goal is to hit that 70% goal that everybody talks about. That's the North Star that guides that coalition, and everything that we do is aimed in that direction. This session, I echo a lot of what Neil said. We were very excited about the SNAP bill, also very excited about the bill that establishes the college grant and makes the timing of the college grant and the timing of Pell the same. Those, I think, were big, huge wins in what was a short session. With the coalition, we generally put our agenda together over the summer, so I don't want to speak for the coalition generally, but I think some of the things that are going to be interesting us in the next session are definitely going to be outreach in the way that Neil was talking about. If we can create a system where the guaranteed admissions program and a guaranteed financial aid program are together, and we can go to people and say, you're in and it's free, I think we will make huge strides. We're also, I think, very interested in outreach programs. I mean, passing something like the SNAP bill is aligning things at the level of state agencies. I think we need to do more in terms of outreach from individual institutions to the regions and communities that they serve. There was a bill a few years ago that now Senator Hansen introduced that had a lot of outreach stuff in it. And I think as a coalition, we're going to be very focused on trying to bring funding to get people out into high schools and convince them, recruit them in the way that Neil was talking about to come to college. We were especially interested in the guaranteed admissions bill. As Neil said, that didn't really get over the finish line, but I think it will be coming back in some sort of form in the next session. And we'll be very interested in not only creating the guaranteed admissions program, but eliminating some of the barriers that still exist, even with guaranteed admissions. The two things that our polling always says that people are that are the biggest barriers to college are, one, affordability. Number one with a bullet all the time, it's about money. And two, hassle, the kinds of bureaucratic barriers that we put in people's way in order to get into college and become successful in college. We want to see what we can do to eliminate as many of those barriers as possible. One of the things that we've been talking about a little bit and was an idea that got some real traction about 9 or 10 years ago was the idea of reducing tuition. Again, the number one problem in terms of getting people into college is affordability. In 2015, this state did something that no other state did. We reduced tuition by 25%, which is what a lot of states did, but we also backfilled that lost tuition to the institutions with state support. We basically shifted the burden of the cost of college from the students to the state. And the more that we can do that, the more we can eliminate the sticker shock of tuition and bring those costs down. I think the more that we will be able to recruit the students who are currently walking around thinking, I don't get to go to college. Two other things that I would just mention as part of this is, one, capital investments in higher education. We talk a lot about student debt, and student debt is obviously a huge problem. The kind of debt we don't talk as much about is institutional debt. The institutions currently, in order to build housing for students or faculty, need to float bonds and take on a lot of institutional debt. There was some nascent interest at the beginning of last session in the state maybe taking on some of that debt, or the state beginning to fund, especially housing on campuses, to not only create cheaper housing for students, but also to alleviate housing problems in the communities that our colleges are in. And as much money as our institutions give to bankers on a regular basis, I think that's something we need to take a long, hard look at and start talking about ways that we can reduce that kind of reliance on debt as a way to fund higher education. And the last thing I would mention is the overall budget for higher ed generally. In the last few sessions in Olympia, the percentage increase to the higher ed budget has been lagging behind the percentage increase to the overall budget. Higher ed is becoming a smaller portion of the overall state budget. And I think that's something we need to take a big global look at, and we need to start organizing and campaigning and talking to legislators about higher education as a public good and the need to make sure that we continue to fund public higher education in the way that we fund the overall state budget. That we're losing ground in terms of higher education's percentage of the overall state budget. And that's a conversation we should be having in terms of trying to regain that ground and take that territory back. So those are the things that I think were interesting about what happened last time and where we should be looking forward. And I'll turn it back over to Joel now.
Thanks, Bill. I do want to remind our listeners too that you're welcome to submit questions into our Q&A feature for our panelists. We do have a little bit more to talk about before we turn to those, but just briefly, Nancy and Neil, was there any reaction to Bill's comments or anything you want to add on that front before we move forward?
I think I would just like to say thank you for bringing up the higher ed budget and making sure that folks are actively advocating and talking to legislators about fully funding public goods as higher ed. We don't have a lot of legislators who sit on the higher ed committee in the Senate, so I think it is critical to really have those conversations since they won't be having them unless they're in that committee. But thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah, I'd like to play off of Bill's comments about outreach. I think that's not something I mentioned, but I appreciate Bill bringing it up because I do believe that a fundamental problem in our work with students is this belief gap, right? I talked about it before that if you apply, you might get in. That students just don't see themselves in post-secondary education. They don't necessarily think that they're ready for it. They don't think that they'll get in. There's just a lack of knowledge about their opportunities available to them. And so, we were supportive of that bill, House Bill 2025, which Joel talked about, which allows state work study to be used for near peer mentors. One of the best ways that you can talk to high school students is to have somebody who's currently in college to come to them and say, hey, here's how I did it, here's how I was able to do it, you can do it too. I think that's a really powerful tool that we'll be able to use. But I also think that there's value in more and varied types of people talking to students. So what Bill was talking about was outreach from the institutions themselves. I mean, I think one of the great things about the guaranteed admissions program is the colleges themselves, the council presidents is sending out an email with the logos of those universities on them saying, hey, this is from us, this is from the institutions, and we're guaranteeing you admission. It's not, some state government bureaucracy, no offense to WASAC, telling you that you might get in, but it's actually the institutions themselves reaching out and saying, hey, we want you to come to our institution. And I think, more of that, I think would be helpful. And then I think also there's a role for, K-12 to play. One of the trusted advisors that students have are their teachers, their counselor, the principal, people like that, telling them, hey, you have opportunities available to you. And I think there's more to explore in that space too. And I think there's just a lot more that we can do there. And then I would also echo Bill's comments about, our advocacy. I think there's a lot of people on this call who care about, higher education and credential attainment among students. And, in the past few years, the legislature has kind of put, higher education into the WIA box, the Workforce Education Investment Account, and said, that's your money over there. The general fund is now for all the other stuff. And I think, Bill's point is that higher education represents 8% of the state budget. And so, if higher education just gets stuck in the WIA bucket, and however much that grows over time, that's a really limited amount of money that's available for investment in these things that we're talking about. And so I think, it's on us to put forward, good ideas that the legislature will see as good investments that would be worthy of general fund investment. But I do think that, we need to be prepared to say, hey, these good ideas should be funded, and that, we deserve a greater share of the general fund and not just get stuck in this WIA bucket. So those are two things I would say that I appreciate Bill bringing up.
Awesome. Yeah. Sorry to put you both on the spot, but I appreciate the conversation and for all three of you just kind of diving into these questions. I think that you all have touched on, some of the key issues and bills you're really excited about this session, as well as some of the things that you would hope to move forward, maybe were disappointed that died the session. Before we get into a couple of the questions from attendees, as we look ahead toward the 2025-27 biennium and even beyond that, are there any issues that stick out to you as kind of like the signature things in post-secondary education that we're going to be working on in future years? And would love to start with Nancy or, we'll start with Nancy again.
Thank you, Joe. I think one of the things we really liked this session was the streamlining of a lot of bureaucracy to reduce barriers for students. So kind of going back to the SNAP bill, families already filled out an application proving their income. And so ensuring that application is a one like fits for other programs like the Washington College Grant will really help us cater to those first generation families that have not traditionally known how to fill out college apps or financial aid applications that can be kind of prohibiting to access programs like this. So we really like the idea of being able to pair up different programs and make sure that folks in Washington know that they're eligible, they know they can go to college, and they know that it's an option for their family. So I really look forward to seeing more brainstorming on that front. I think that with a lot the progress that we have made in the college grant, like Neil and Bill kind of were talking about, outreach is going to be really critical because there is a huge gap of knowledge, like the Neil mentioned, and families. Like, these programs are out there. The legislature has made a lot of progress and being able to offer accessible higher education. However, the public may not know this. I know I went to college in the time where the college grant was not an entitlement. And so I had a lot of folks around me, including myself, who were eligible for aid, but did not receive that aid. And so there is a huge sentiment of, oh, I'm going to fill out the FAFSA, but I'm not going to get anything out of it, or I qualify or whatever, but I'm not going to get anything. So we do want to diminish those perceptions and make sure that folks know that they can access these things. Another one that we've been talking a lot about at the WSA is, when we get these first generation low income students, do our schools have the infrastructure to actually support them? Traditionally, higher education has never been accessible to these type of families and socioeconomic issues. And so we want to make sure that when they get to campus, they don't just go for a quarter and then feel bad about all the things they don't have access to, like access to a computer, access to a good food, affordable food, not just top ramen, right? And so that they feel that their experience in college is the same as those that do have more socioeconomic resources for them to be able to solely focus on campus. I had multiple jobs during going to college, and it did not, those are late night, early mornings, and it doesn't fit in the college schedule when you're in more rigorous programs. So if you're studying things like pre-med, which we know things like STEM, medical fields are huge fields we're looking at filling up, and their rigorous programs do not align with folks being able to balance 2 jobs or kids. So we're having a lot of conversations about how our infrastructure at our universities do actually help these families with that background, so they can actually not just get to college, but also get onto the graduation stage. Yeah, these are the discussions we've been having.
Awesome. Thanks, Nancy. Neil?
I think that's a great point, Nancy. We're really focused on enrollment right now because if you look at the, over the last, 15 years or so, high school graduation has gone up, post-secondary graduation has gone up, but enrollment as a percentage of students has gone down. And so we're really zeroed in and focused on that metric. But we can't lose sight of the fact that once you invite these students to participate, and you get the students that we're talking about, low income students of color on campus, that we don't want to just leave them to their own devices and just leave them without support. So I do think that focusing on how do we complete more students is an important part of the conversation that we shouldn't lose sight of in our effort to enroll more students, because enrollment obviously is not the goal. Credential attainment is the goal. And I think even though our institutions do a good job, compared to national data around, completion, it's still, a pretty small percentage relative to the overall students who enroll, who end up making it to a credential. So I think we can always do a better job of actually completing more students. And as far as the enrollment conversation goes, obviously, I talked about marrying up guaranteed admissions with guaranteed financial aid. I think that really is a game changer that we'll be talking about for a long time. And I think there's work to do. Both with the continuing the idea of SNAP. There's other programs we might be able to add. And then and one of the things that I think we want to make sure and touch on is that bill really got narrowed throughout the legislative session. So it was initially intended to be all SNAP recipients, and the legislature narrowed it down to just students, just high school students, which is great. That's obviously a population of people that we talk about, but there's also 300,000 SNAP recipients who are adults, and those adults have the opportunity to improve their lives and to upskill, and our employers need them, and that's maybe even a more immediate return on investment for the state, to provide notification to adults that there is training opportunities available to them, and financial aid available to them to go in and upskill their career. So that's something I think that we should be talking more about in the future sessions. And then I think obviously there's a lot of interest in financial aid. You heard Nancy mention it. There was these college promise program bills that were introduced in the legislative session, and I think as a sector, as a coalition of stakeholders, I think we need to start wrestling to the ground these ideas of promise versus the college grant, and how do we work out, how do we want to expand financial aid benefits and make it a logical process that works for students. So I think that's what we're going to end up talking a lot about as well.
Thanks, Neil. Bill?
Yeah, I would just second everything that Neil and Nancy have said, and sort of organize it maybe in three categories. One, outreach. I think I would really want to double down on what Nancy was talking about in terms of outreach. There's nothing that works better than near peer mentoring in terms of getting, first generation students who are in college now out to talk to students who could be first generation students next year. Affordability again is kind of everything, and coming, sort of drafting behind a little bit of what Neil was saying. A lot of the affordability programs that we have are popping up in a variety of different places, and maybe getting a more holistic view of that, with the dream at the end of that rainbow being that college would be free and we wouldn't need promise programs or financial aid programs. It would just be free. And if you took all the money that we appropriate to institutions now and all the money that we spend on financial aid and added another $2 or $3 billion to it, it could be free. And $2 or $3 billion sounds like a lot of money, but in the context of a $72 billion state budget, it's not unattainable. So I think that a nice holistic look at affordability with an aim toward making it just as cheap or free as possible at the end is something, a big thing we should be talking about. And the final bucket would be retention. And one of the questions in the Q&A is talks about the quality of higher education. Access is great, but the cost-benefit ratio is just disproportionate. There's nothing, I mean, lots and lots of studies have shown that there's nothing that helps a student stay in school. And full disclosure here, this is me pimping from the faculty side of things here. There's nothing that helps a student stay in school more than a real relationship with a faculty member who has the time and the resources to treat them as the individuals that they are. Cost, spending on instruction as a percentage has been lagging behind spending on administration in our public universities over the last 5 or 6 years. That's maybe something we want to try to reduce. And again, we have lots of, as we have financial aid programs and promise programs and all kinds of policy ideas that come up, we build lots of bureaucracy around them that sooner or later probably we don't need as much of. And looking back at some of that bureaucracy and maybe starting to talk about the ways in which we can shift some funding from administrative costs to actual instruction costs would be a larger question to deal with too. More tenure track faculty with the time and resources to do their jobs. Nothing helps students more than that.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that. Just want to touch on, we have a few more, maybe like 5 or 6 minutes here to touch on a couple other questions. Someone asked about, kind of ongoing work outside of covering the cost of tuition and fees. So thinking about the cost of living, whether that's again housing, food, transportation, childcare. This was submitted anonymously, and I can reply with a couple resources in the chat here. But do any of you have thoughts on maybe some of the work going on to support student basic needs security and kind of those costs of college or post secondary education that fall outside of tuition and fees?
I defer to Nancy on this question. If you want to cover it, Nancy, I'm happy to if you don't want to.
I can kind of kick it off and then have you go. Thank you guys. So I think one of the biggest highlights that I can promote as a resource is our supporting students experiencing homelessness program. This program was actually brought to the WSA about, I want to say now 5, 6 years ago, by a student who was formerly a foster student. And so this program targets students who don't currently have any way of housing and probably came from a similar kind of background in their teenage years. And so this allows them to have affordable housing and resources such as showers, access to facilities like laundry, and other things on campus for free. There are similar programs like that I'm sure Joel can send out an email about on all of our campuses, and we fully intend on coming back and making sure that those are fully funded and expanded as need is shown. That being said, we also passed our our Basic Needs Act, which ensures that we have navigators on campus. Like I mentioned earlier, those students who would be low income or first gen can come into a place on campus where they talk to a navigator who will show them the different resources that our state has that isn't necessarily institutional support, but state support to make sure that they can meet their basic needs. We have food pantries on campus currently filled by volunteers who are also students. And so kind of back to that peer-to-peer mentorship, those students are full with resources and they know the different food banks, not just in the campus, but on the town, so they can guide each other to make sure that they're always fully fed. That being said, those are the things that we have on the ground active today, and we do acknowledge that it's not nearly enough to meet the need. So we will continue having these conversations, and I think one of the biggest things that our students are doing on the ground to address this is volunteering themselves. Like I mentioned, a lot of these positions on campus, food pantry workers, cafeteria workers, they're all students, feeding students, housing students. One big population that I think will help push our supporting students experiencing homelessness is there's a lot of couch surfing in college currently. A lot of students stay with other students temporarily, and this is not a sustainable way to live, and it is not sustainable to really be able to dive into your academics. So I see the plug for the Washington State Opportunity Scholarship. That one's the big one. It offers mentorship by other students or folks who had just graduated in those fields. So I think a lot of the basic needs that we have on campus are filled by students for other students. And I want to keep encouraging you all to support such measures and know that we're going to come back and ask for expansion of the programs that are currently on the ground working and helping students. So I'll pass it over to Neil now.
I don't have a lot to add beyond. I mean, Nancy is doing great work in this area, and we're just pleased to support her in what she's doing. So, Joel, if you want to move on to a different question, or you want to.
Well, can I just add one thing to that?
Sure.
I mean, I'd really follow up on what Nancy's talking about in terms of housing. There's precedent for this. California has recently invested huge amounts of money in building new student and faculty housing around their universities. And, those are one-time capital expenditures that if you're not going into debt to do them, make the house, alleviate some of the housing crunches in the areas around the universities and colleges, and make it cheaper for students. A big capital investment in university and college housing, I think, would go a long way toward meeting some of those basic needs things that Nancy's talking about. And again, there's precedent for this. They're doing this in other states.
Actually, I do want to add one more thing. A few years ago, I think 2 years ago, Tacoma Community College brought forward a program that we wanted to scale out. to more folks around the state, but it was a private-public partnership between housing authorities and the universities. I believe it was at UW-Tacoma as well as Tacoma Community College, where they were able to offer lower rates of housing with private private housing. And they were able to offer students vouchers if they were currently attending the nearby institution. And so, although that policy failed, like Bill said, there is a lot of precedent out there for things that we can do to subsidize the cost of housing, specifically, and other things like transportation, to ensure that our students have what they need to have a roof over their head and be able to study and get good grades. So I do want to highlight those programs, and I hope that folks will continue to support them.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all for the conversation and contributions. I really appreciate that. I think before we kind of move to our closing activity, I know we won't get to every question today, but there was a note about just like as a teacher, as a student, as a faculty member, as someone who supports students, like how can you get involved in the work that you all do at your organizations and sectors? I was wondering if we could maybe do like a quick, just like a quick answer for each of you. Like what if someone wants to know more about either your sector or like some of your policy priorities, like what's the best way for them to reach out and get involved with your groups? And I'll go to Nancy first, sorry.
Okay, thank you. So quick way is just shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to sit down with folks. We also have our social media where students are consistently posting about what they're up to on their campuses that you can support. I would encourage you to go donate to your local food pantry at your local community college or university. That's kind of like on the social side. Support any bills that we're moving forward with. Our legislative agenda gets released in about October. So I will make sure folks have that. But I think so that's like on the advocate side, just supporting your local students. On the student side, if you're looking to get involved with more with the WSA, please talk to your student government or come talk to me. I will put my contact information in the chat so you can help us advocate. And I think for everyone else, one big thing we're introducing one big thing at the WSA is that we, in the interim, focus a lot on programming and training for civic engagement, making sure that students are not only active during the legislative session, but making sure that they're registering to vote and consistently going to town halls and such. So that being said, the cost of these things are increasing. And so we do take donations at our events, and we are starting to have fundraising events. So anything that you can do to help our association do programming and training for students will really help make sure that students have the resources to advocate at the state level. But yeah, and I will send all that information in the chat for those interested.
Yeah,
Oh.
sorry, Heather.
Well, I was just also going to add, I think that part of, WASAC bringing everybody together today is we hope to provide another vehicle for folks to engage, not just with WASAC, but again, these partners that we brought today and down the road in the future, elevating this coalition model that we really are all trying to work together towards increasing that broader investment to support students' post-secondary attainment. And I know Joel will share our contact information at the end of this, and also amplifying that we have lots of other staff within the agency that are available. If you are really particularly interested in this basic needs area, Amy Magasos runs point on that work. We have somebody that runs point on our enrollment work, one that is for affordability and one that is for completion. And so there's a lot of opportunities to get a little bit more hands-on in the weeds if you are up for that. At any point throughout the year, going back to, you don't just like come up with a legislative proposal right before the session starts. This is ongoing work that we want to be more involved with folks that are interested in participating in it. So go ahead, Neil. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I would echo that I think that the stakeholder work that's been being done by WASAC has really bubbled up a lot of these great ideas like the SNAP bill, and so we really appreciate the partnership with all of you. And up through WASAC and WASAC putting these ideas forward that helps us all to be organized and advocate for them. If you want to engage with the roundtable, our website, we have got all of our thought leadership work gets put up on our website, and we send out blast emails. Also, our education foundation, the Partnership for Learning, there's a sign up opportunity there on our website to get alerts of some of our thought leadership information, and also we send out alerts once in a while that let people know kind of what's happening in the sector from our perspective, and what bills are going on in Olympia and that sort of thing. So that's a good way to engage with us there.
Three things. If you are a part of an organization on this webinar and aren't already part of the College Promise Coalition, and you're an organization that cares about higher ed, please reach out and join us, and we'll sign you up to get you part of our regular meetings. Second, if you're an alumni from one of our public universities, we have lots of alumni organizing that goes on. So if you start getting email from UW Impact or WSU Impact or Western Advocates or Eastern Advocates, don't just delete that. Open it and do what it says in terms of writing to your legislators and telling them what's what. And finally, we're coming up to a big election season. And, many of you might be involved in various kinds of campaigns in terms of, candidates reaching out to you or being donors to campaigns. Every time you're talking to somebody who's running for something in this state, tell them you care about higher ed and you want them to care about higher ed too. At the end of the day, politicians do what voters and donors want them to do. So if you're a voter and a donor and are talking to politicians, let them know that higher ed is high on your agenda, is something you care about and something they should care about.
Thanks so much, Bill, and thanks everyone. Rather than reshare my slides and then transition to something else, I'm going to put a link in the chat to our closing activity, and then share my screen for a second to kind of explain what this is. Then I'll also put Heather and I's contact information in the chat as well. So to capture your folks' feedback today.
Thank you to our panelists for joining us.
Yes.
Bill, Neil, and Nancy, appreciate your participation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I was getting ahead of myself. Thank you. Yes. To Nancy, Neil, and Bill, we are really grateful for your insights and your partnership and strategy and just perspectives. Really, really critical. And we look forward to working with you, of course, this interim and in future sessions. So
thank you so much for having us.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, apologies for that, folks. As we are finishing up here today, again, I did want to share this activity. So this, the link in the chat here, this is a Padlet. It's kind of an online dashboard where you can share your thoughts. And we would love to take a quick snapshot based on your reactions to today's webinar, or just information you're thinking about at your school district or your institution or your sector organization related to post-secondary education. And so we've separated this out by columns relating to our policy clusters. And essentially how it works is that you can just click the plus icon below a field like student supports, for instance, and you can add your thought. So if I am interested in saying, I'd like students to get more support for housing and food security, I can say that here. And then all you do is just press publish and it'll show up in the column below. And so this is just a way for us to kind of aggregate our ideas for the session ahead and future years. And we would love to have you take a moment to just share your thoughts and feedback on this. This is a public link. It will remain open. So you can share this with your colleagues to see ideas from other attendees. But again, otherwise, please feel free to take a moment and add your thoughts to this, just so we can continue to be strong partners with you all. And I'll stop sharing my screen here. But with that being said, I will also put Heather and I's emails in the chat for continued follow-up and questions. And with that, we just want to say thank you for, again, your partnership and your attendance today. We're really looking forward to reaching out, working together this interim and next session. And thanks so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Be in touch. Have a great Monday.